Now we're going to talk about the legal and regulatory impact of the financial crisis. And to moderate this panel, we are very lucky to have Jennifer Francis, who is the Duke University Executive Vice Provost and Distinguished Professor at the Fuqua School of Business. So Jennifer and panel, thank you.
Thanks. Thanks, everyone. And let me just start by welcoming everyone here and also giving a real big shout out, Doug, for you to organize this, and also for both Fuqua and the law school for helping to organize and host. Last but not least, I know there are numerous people here coming from the financial industry, the community, regulatory type positions. I really want to thank all of you, because I don't think this would have nearly the impact that it will without your part in that. So, as Lee mentioned, I'm the Executive Vice Provost for Duke. I'm very delighted to call my home, my faculty home here at Fuqua, and I've been up there for a few years, and I'm really delighted to be the Douglas and Joseph Breeden Professor of Business. So thank you, Doug, for that. One of the things our panelists, I'd like to briefly introduce our panelists for today. I think we have a wonderful group. First, on my far left is Jim Cox. Many of you know Jim. Jim is a distinguished professor in the School of Law. He is a prolific writer, publisher of articles and highly significant texts that are used in law schools around the world. He's also very much sought after by many for his insights, particularly regarding regulation and governance. In the middle, we have Sarah Bloom Rankin, who is the former Deputy Secretary of the U.S. Department of the Treasury, where I believe you served from 2014 to 2017, roughly. She also served as governor of the Federal Reserve Board. And I think what Sarah is best known for is really her creative ways to think about supporting the U.S. economy, infrastructure, et cetera. So we're delighted to have Sarah here with us. And to my direct left is Stephen Schwarcz, who's a professor in the law school, also a distinguished professor, also prolific in somewhat different ways from Jim. His specialties are around insolvency and bankruptcy law. So I think they'll all bring some different perspectives to the questions that our panel is looking at. Our panel is titled 10 Years from the Bottom. And what we thought we would do is we really want to focus most of our time on kind of post-crisis issues, but we have a few that we thought were pre-crisis and during crisis that we wanted to address. And we have a few questions, much like the previous panel, that I'm going to use to kickstart things. But I also want to note to the audience that we have reserved plenty of time for your participation and your questions that will come in. So please feel free to jot them down if there's an extension of this, or save them until we reach that point. So again, a little bit on pre-crisis that we wanted to start with, and I'd like to direct this one to Sarah, because I think she will have some unique and interesting views on it. Really is around, what did you think the key weaknesses were in the regulatory structures prior to the crisis?
Great, and thank you, Jennifer, for putting this together, and Lee and really the entire Duke community. I think these are critical sets of discussions now that we're having, primarily because there were huge lessons that can come out of what was really the greatest financial crisis that the U.S. And the world really had experienced since the Great Depression. And so the enormity of it, you saw, the people who were here earlier saw that, saw the film snippets, which brought back, all kinds of shivers and bad memories for people who were there and who experienced it. And we are now, in terms of our own sort of trajectory, where we are in the U.S. economy and really in the world economy, is moving to a place of slower growth, of higher sort of taking off the guardrails, taking off the sort of safety mechanisms that were put in. And so a lot of people are really asking questions about, are we going to be equipped for what comes next? So these are really timely sets of discussions, and commend you for launching this. So what we're going to do, what I think what your question really helps us do is talk about what the regulatory structure looked like prior to the financial crisis, and then what it looked like, what it looks like now. And I think you heard in the prior panel, and this is, there's certainly many dimensions to what caused the financial crisis. But from a structural perspective, let's say something about what the regulatory structure itself looked like, what the regulatory model was for understanding finance and the economy. So there really are kind of four areas that have had where the regulatory structure is relevant. One, what was the regulatory structure in place for financial stability? Two, what was the regulatory structure that was in place for consumer protection? Three, what was the regulatory structure that was in place for home finance? And four, what was the regulatory structure in place for wholesale funding? So those four areas are all major contributors to the financial crisis. People weigh them different ways. But let's talk about what the regulatory pieces were that guided each of those. So pre-crisis, to go back to financial stability, we have a very dispersed regulatory system, right? We have a state system, we have a federal system, and in the federal system, we don't have a single regulator. We have functional regulators. So you essentially have the Fed, you have the SEC, you have the CFTC, you have the OCC, the FDIC. It's like an alphabet soup here. But essentially, we don't, in the US, organize ourselves around a single regulator. It is dispersed regulation. Many people argue that that dispersion of regulatory authority created silos, and those silos had pretty high walls, and people did not understand, policymakers did not understand, the argument goes, what was developing inside the crevices between the silos. Right? So one theme, I think one regulatory theme, is the idea of how do we address financial stability from a regulatory oversight perspective. This is the question of systemic risk. How should policymakers look at systemic risk? The regulatory structure that existed prior to the crisis did not have a single agency responsible for financial stability. So that was one issue. And I won't give the answers, I'll just give you, that was a pre-crisis issue. Second, consumer protection and consumer finance. It was very much assumed in the pre-crisis days that the existing regulatory authorities would handle consumer protection as pretty much a byproduct maybe of safety and soundness or something different from safety and soundness. But the idea was that each agency would take a little bit of the consumer protection perspective into account. Some agencies did it better than others, but the bottom line was that it didn't have a single home. Okay, so that was a second feature of the regulatory structure. The third is housing finance. So what we did is we lived in a world of GSEs. We essentially had Fannie, Freddie, Lori Goodman talked about the private mortgage market as well. But from a federal regulatory perspective, it was Fannie and Freddie, these GSEs, that were in essence the drivers of housing finance and how housing finance got looked at. The argument there being pre-crisis, and you've heard this in various ways this morning, that there is a misalignment there regarding the fact that some would argue that the GSEs, by having the full faith and credit of the US government behind mortgages, actually skewed mortgage lending, mortgage underwriting in an undesirable way. the argument goes. We can, we can debate that. And the fourth piece, wholesale funding markets, not very well understood prior to the financial crisis. The wholesale funding markets, this is the repos, the tri-party settlement issues, all sorts, securities lending. This sort of activity was really not well understood, and certainly didn't have a particular regulatory home pre-crisis. So those four pieces, and we'll talk about what happened, post DoddFrank, post financial crisis, to address those from a regulatory perspective. But that's really the kind of lay of the land, what things looked like pre-crisis.
Thank you. Jim or Steve, do either of you want to add? I was thinking particularly around credit rating agencies.
Well, I've got to talk more generally than that, and that is that just to double what Sarah was saying, you have these four buckets out there that she was concerned with, and each one of them had really terrible incentives. And so if I were going to point to a new, it's the incentive. But you should start off at the top. I mean, we had a chairman of the House Financial Services who, as a matter of political faith, really believed in home ownership and put pressure on the government agencies. And we got home ownership. Of course, went into bankruptcy shortly after that. So we did that. We had banks playing with other people's money. I mean, we had deposits with the implicit guarantee, and so the banks were able to play with money. You had a whole credit rating agencies having an assuming role as a monopoly regulators, because the instruments that blew up the systems were basically all instances in which issuers bought the ratings, and there's only a single rating. It's not like the bond issues, where, to be sure, companies do pay for the bond ratings, but you had multiple ratings, so you had some sort of check on one on the other like that with the CDOs and what have you. That wasn't the case. So if you just go down the line of a whole series of corrupting incentives that fed off of the very problems that Sarah was talking about, and along with the siloing, I think that's the biggest problem that I think there. So, and the question going forward, which I know we're not supposed to talk about right now, but we'll come back to what extent it be correct. The answer is somewhat.
I'll just mention securitization and tie that into rating agencies. Securitization is essentially a technique by which firms, banks as an example, would make loans, and they would then sell the loans off from time to time. And the loans would be essentially purchased in packages by sophisticated investors. This concept, the so-called originate to distribute model of lending, was believed to create moral hazard in that the lenders were not ultimately responsible for the creditworthiness of the loans, and that was believed to generate essentially a lot of poor quality lending. That does call into question a number of things, such as why didn't the investors who ultimately took the risk, why didn't they engage in due diligence? And also, many of these deals were insured by so-called monoline insurance companies, and why didn't they then look at the risk? If you originate a loan, it's a junky loan, you may not be able to sell it. So that is an issue that I'll talk about in terms of post-crisis regulation. The securities that were sold in these securitization transactions were all rated by the credit rating agencies, Standard & Poor's, Moody's being the most prominent, others, Fitch, for example. And the credit rating agencies gave the very highest creditworthiness ratings, AAA, to many of these senior securities that were sold off. And there is a question, how come during the crisis, many of these AAA rated securities were then downgraded to less than AAA, and many of the lower rated securities actually ended up defaulting. And there are allegations, for example, that credit rating agencies had a very poor incentive system because they charged and continue to charge the issuer the securities for the rating. And the issuer, of course, wants the highest rating. I like to compare it, one of my hobbies is wine, and there's this magazine, Robert Parker, The Wine Advocate, some of you may know of it, and they say, we never get paid by the wineries, we only get paid by our magazine subscriptions, we have no conflict of interest. And questions as to whether that conflict of interest may have essentially affected the quality of the ratings. Another question, though, is when you have credit ratings, which ultimately are predictions of future performance, how can you foretell the future? Standard & Poor's, when it rated these securitization transactions pre-crisis, especially those backed by mortgage loans, assumed that the housing market could decline by as much as 20%. That was part of the way it stressed its ratings. But ultimately, the housing market declined by over 30%, more than during the Great Depression. And one would question as to whether you ever can predict something like that.
Thanks all. Thanks everyone. I know we're moving really quickly now out of pre-crisis, but I'm assuming that most of us are familiar with some of the things that were happening or were in place back then. I'd like, if we could, to move to during the crisis and talk about some of the regulations that were implemented during that time. And I'll note that our previous panel touched on a couple of these, TARP, as well as Lori, I think, talked about the HAMP program, and we'll talk about that one as well. Jim, could you perhaps first just give I appreciate, Steve, your brief explanation, because I'm assuming that the audience comes from varying levels, and so I appreciate your explaining to folks about securitizations. Jim, could you talk just briefly about what TARP was, and then give your thoughts on how effective it was?
Well, let me give you my initial understanding what everybody thought TARP was, and then I'm going to leave it to Sarah and others to talk about what became of it, so I have John's view. But we all remember that we were in the midst of a campaign at that point, and both presidential candidates suspended their campaigns to go to Washington because they felt very, very saw the importance of TARP being passed. And that was a symbolic moment. I mean, and I think TARP was sort of symbolic, and I think that's what I'll take, and I'll let others disabuse me of that. And that is the following, that TARP initially was going to be buying troubled assets. And you're going to get the bad money out of the good banks. And, you know, the op-ed piece that Lawrence Baxter, who's in the audience here, and I and another wrote, took a different course of that. Our idea was let's get the good bank out of the bad banks and sort of divide up the banks and break it, but nobody bought into that. But TARP was supposed to buy these troubled assets that were sitting around. You know, I think most of us, at least I did, I thought it was an incredible just stage, publicity stunt. And secondly, that it was because it was an insufficient amount of money. And so it gets passed, and I think it did show that government was, one, taking the problem seriously, and two, taking some actions there, and that this was bipartisan because we saw both the Republican and Democratic candidates coming back, suspending their campaigns at a very delicate moment, come back and do that. The rest was TARP just goes and does something else. So I'll let others talk about what else it did. But it did have the tremendous symbolic gesture. And I think that's not to be underrated. I think that every financial crisis, that the key to getting out of it is restoring confidence that somebody's in control, okay? And, regardless of your politics, I celebrated the fact that you had individuals who stepped forward, who were of a different party than I am, okay, who were trying to get things moving. And I think that's what you need to get out of a crisis. And TARP was symbolic for that reason.
Yeah, I think that's Jim, I think you got it exactly right. I mean, there was definitely a pivot. I mean, TARP began as an open-ended. I mean, the first vote on TARP did not succeed. It was a massive failure. Part of it was because it was completely open-ended. Hank Bernanke and Ben Bernanke, Hank Paulson and Ben Bernanke, they've merged into one. Went to the Hill and said, we are in a panic mode here. We need open-ended assistance. We don't know the scale of the problem. We will not cap the amount at this point. Well, that turned out to be an absolute disaster. The bill, by the way, the original bill, the open-ended one, was 1.5 pages. You'll remember that, Joe Smith, right? I mean, that was astonishing. Like, open-ended assistance with no cap. I mean, that had no chance of passing at all. But what it did do, to Professor Cox's point, is it showed really the depths of panic that had set in. Nobody knew essentially how deep this was going to be. And there needed to be, but it failed, and there needed to be another attempt. As it turned out, the second attempt succeeded. It did not succeed really in a bipartisan way. Maybe President Bush at the time was feeling the heat as well, and McCain at the time wanted to pick up that mantle. But in terms of the congressional vote, it was split. It was actually the Democratic majority that carried the TARP bill. The one that ultimately passed was capped. Still, it was an extraordinarily high number, but it was capped. It was immediately viewed as something that was pretty disgusting. People were appalled that the banks were bailed out as this vernacular started to seep into public consciousness. It was viewed as something that was, in essence, a giveaway to the banks, and people very much started running away from it. And later, which is just extraordinary about what this whole day is going to be, you're going to hear more about some of those political consequences to some of these early votes. But the point is that TARP morphed. It could not anymore be about buying bad assets because, frankly, the books of the banks were looked at and there were a lot of bad assets. I mean, it was almost viewed as an impossible task to try to get all of this toxic stuff out of the balance sheets of all the financial institutions in the system. It was just considered too hard. So at that point, TARP was, and there have been some really interesting sort of back scenes debates on this, but the language of TARP, if you read it strictly, it looks as if it is about purchasing bad assets. It became stretched to become about recapitalizing the bank. So it became about capitalizing infusions and bringing more capital into the banks. The banks at the time did not want to take the money. It was not an easy sell. Interesting debates about why would the banks not want this. This was cheap capital. The Treasury was going to have preferred shares and little pieces of ownership in the banks, but wouldn't exercise any real voting rights or any kind of ownership rights. And yet the banks did not initially want to take the money. They did take the money. It goes again to Professor Cox's point about confidence. How do we, in essence, bring up this idea of we're going to strengthen the bank's balance sheets? That will become the foundation by which we start to rebuild the economy. Okay, that's also, I think, a critical piece that is important in understanding the trajectory of the different pieces of reform that were put in place as a response to the crisis. The idea was save the financial sector and we'll save the economy. It was that kind of focus. If we can rebuild confidence in Wall Street, we'll be able to rebuild confidence at Main Street. And I'll stop there because that turns out to be a kind of debatable proposition.
Yeah. I agree completely with Jim and Sarah about the need for confidence. A lot was based on that. But they've spoken primarily about reestablishing faith in banks, in financial institutions, entities. And one thing that TARP did is it recognized, and post-crisis regulation does not adequately recognize, I think we'll talk about that later, the importance of the financial markets. Prior to the crisis, and even more so perhaps today, most corporate funding is not through banks, but through capital markets. And one of the consequences of the beginning of the financial crisis was I mentioned the loss of faith in credit ratings. And this loss of faith continued not only from mortgage-backed securities to other types of debt securities, and even to the commercial paper funding market, short-term promissory notes issued by companies to fund themselves. And companies could not essentially fund themselves through commercial paper. One of the critical points of TARP is it created the so-called commercial paper funding facility. And this assured that companies would be able to issue commercial paper. It would be guaranteed by the government if needed. And this was an essential element in restoring confidence in the financial system and the economy. And as I'll observe later, it's an element I think that's missing from the DoddFrank bill and post-crisis regulation.
Thank you. I know Lori mentioned the effectiveness of HAMP in the earlier panel, and I'm curious about the panel's views on some of the during crisis regulation that were really more directed at the homeowners, whether it's HAMP or HARP. And Sarah, I'm going to kind of point to you on this and see what your thoughts were. I think you heard Lori's comment that HAMP probably saved about 8 million in homes. Lori, do I have that about right?
That was proprietary laws, but that was sort of mine.
Okay. Sarah?
Yeah, so, you know, as I said, the strategy was first rebuild confidence on Wall Street, Main Street will follow. The HAMP and HARP programs were the attempts really to begin to deal with what was going on regarding the massive numbers of foreclosures. You know, in retrospect, I think that these strategies should not have been sequential. You know, ideally, they would have been done in parallel. Because what happened, in essence, was that because HAMP and HARP came later, we didn't get the recovery off to a sort of a, we didn't do enough really to catalyze a quicker recovery, because it turned out that the foreclosures were a major drag on being able to rebuild momentum. Why? First of all, if your house is underwater, meaning you owe more on it than it's worth, you can't sell it. Well, guess what? If you're out of work and you actually need to get another job and move somewhere, you're going to have to, you know, you're going to have to sell your house. If you can't sell it, you can't get the job, and this becomes one of those other vicious cycles that, you know, Lori, you know, so aptly, you know, diagrams. So, it was an issue that HAMP and HARP came late. Not only did they come late, they came in a way that put a lot of constraints around them. So they were voluntary programs. They didn't, you know, mortgage servicers were not required to participate in them, and they had a lot of rules around them. Okay, where did these rules come from? You also heard this idea of moral hazard, right? Moral hazard became now a theme that developed after TARP came into play, right? So the banks, you know, were able to recapitalize, and then people started to think, wait a minute, how is it that some of these banks are all benefiting from taxpayer assistance, but they all, you know, haven't done particularly great things. Some had better internal controls and risk management than others, and yet they all seem to be benefiting. This notion of like good players and bad players then permeated into questions of home ownership. And it became, you then started to hear, wait a minute, Not all homeowners are equal. Some people really had no business getting into a mortgage, certainly a mortgage that they couldn't afford, or one they didn't understand, or one that they would have no ability to, to be able to pay in a timely way. So the idea of moral hazard started getting moral traction. That turned out to be a big headwind to getting any kind of meaningful home ownership mortgage modification done. So, you heard that, principal modification. That was something that people thought, well, if we could really modify principal, we could move things along more quickly. You couldn't do that. Politically, it was toxic to indicate that you were in favor of principal modification, because you were in essence saying some homeowners should be able to pay less than what they what they took their mortgage out for. So HAMP, HARP, yes, they turned out to be necessary. They came too late. They came with too many conditions. They were merely voluntary. I would argue, not a great success.
Thanks. I'd like to get to the area where I think our panelists and I think our audience are most interested, which is what's happened post-crisis. And I'd like to ask each of you to kind of think about and tell the audience what you think has been one of the most important changes, regulatory-wise, that has occurred. Steve, do you want to start with that?
Sure. Well, when you say important changes, I actually think that the Dodd-Frank Act made some good changes, but made some other changes that are important in terms of being dangerous. And perhaps the worst thing that it did is to try to mitigate so-called moral hazard of too big to fail institutions. It amended Section 13.3 of the Federal Reserve Act, which allows the Federal Reserve to act as a lender of last resort to financial institutions. It limits it quite a bit. And this means that the Fed is not going to have the authority to step in if there is another crisis, and if the so-called orderly liquidation authority does not really help. Other things that Dodd-Frank did is, for example, Congress concluded that the reason securitization went awry was the originate to distribute model and the moral hazard that results from that. And so Congress required that in a securitization, the originators of the loans and the sponsors of the deals have to retain at least 5% sort of risk in the deal, the so-called skin in the game. Now, this is quite fascinating because the market was such that originators and sponsors typically retained 10% risk in many of these deals, at least 5%, 10%, otherwise no one would buy the stuff. And that many of these originators and sponsors retained not only percentage risk, but also the most subordinate, the so-called junior pieces of CDOs, because they thought this really was valuable. And they thought that retaining the junior pieces, this would signal to the market that these were very, very good buys, very good investments. And so we study in school about how you want to reduce asymmetric information. Things have gotten so complex in the financial markets that I think we've gone beyond asymmetric information. We have what I might call mutual misinformation, where the originators of the deals don't fully understand them and then signal to the more senior investors that these are good buys, thereby effectively misleading them. So those are, but I'll defer to others to continue on that.
Jim, what's your thoughts?
So I'm going to start off the area that established my credibility here that I know nothing about, and that would be derivatives. I mean, I talk about derivatives in my securities regulations class, but I don't really dive deeply into that. But I do think that that was a major, major contribution of Dodd-Frank, getting the over-the-counter derivative instruments into a more transparent environment. And some part of that is derivatives, you're not regulating the product. So the thing I talk a lot about are stocks, bonds, et cetera. And you're thinking about disclosure being the major mechanisms, what the mechanisms are for such disclosure and exemptions, what have you. But what we did with Dodd-Frank and derivatives is the fact that you're dealing with the intermediaries, which is where the hotspot was. So fortune clearing and the rules for clearing these trades was terrific for a number of reasons. One, just the collateralization goes along with that, but also just the transparency. Backing out from that, I do think that, we can get into a dispute about who ought to be subject to Volcker, but I think we all ought to agree to one thing: competition's a good thing, and we all ought to play by the same rules. And if you're trading in the marketplace, you're going to be borrowing money. That's just the way in which you goose up your gains. And we all ought to have probably the same borrowing costs. And to the extent that you get a subsidy because you're playing with deposits that the government stands behind, and you have access to that because of the thought that you're too big to fail, probably is not the kind of competition we ought to have. So I like the Volcker rule. Again, the recent changes in that, whether we're going to talk about applying to 8 banks or 80 banks, I can go along with 8 banks. I think that's probably what we do. I don't think the other 72 banks are going to blow up the world, but the 8 might, and 1 or 2 of the 8 might. So I think that was really good. There have been some areas that we've really not made any progress, even though Dodd-Frank had all kinds of rules, et cetera. And if I can just talk about one of those. I mean, one of them is we made the information about asset-backed securities, Steve's area, much more granular, a lot more information there. And so we sit there and we pat ourselves on the back and say, by God, we're not going to have these mortgages, real estate mortgages, all located in maybe Las Vegas or Southern California, junking it all up because they have that sort of systematic risk of just that one area. It's going to go up, all these collectives. So now we're going to be able to peer into this thing and say, all these mortgages are in one area, which is overbuilt. My God, I'm not going to buy this. All that happens with the new SEC rules. The thing is that those SEC rules only apply to registered offerings. So if you have an offering that's guaranteed by Fannie or Freddie, okay, that you're not registering. You've got an exemption, right? So that doesn't happen. And also we have all this money sloshing around in the private area out there. That explains why in the last 3 years there has not been one registered offering with the SEC as a residential mortgage package. Not one. Because it's all either exempt because you have a government entity that's going to stand behind it and takes it out of the securities laws, or it's sloshing around out there in the private market. So we haven't done very much there. How about the credit rating agencies? I mean, I tend to think they've misbehaved. They've had bad incidents. We haven't done a bit about that. Credit rating. We've taken them out of play in several areas for very isolated areas which nobody cares about, nobody uses, but in the securities laws. But they're still out there, slithering on their reputations, and we've not changed anything. If I can just go on 2 more minutes on you. We would not stand for a minute letting KPMG have its own concepts of what accounting principles are and being different, perhaps, from Pricewaterhouse, right? We want to have generally accepted accounting principles, and the opinion letter comes in from the accounting firm that says, look, these all conform with generally accepted accounting principles, and we have followed the following process, generally accepted auditing standards to assure that, right? That's not what happens with credit rating agencies. We don't know what metrics, what their proprietary information is for when they decide that something is investment grade, AAA, whatever. They don't have the same thing. One, they're not, so we don't know what they're saying when they bestow these ratings. Okay. And then we still have this situation where there's only one we've taken care of it, right? We don't have any idea what metrics they're applying, okay? We don't know what process they go to make sure somebody satisfies those metrics, and then we're letting them be purchased. So there is an area where nothing has changed, but the good news is that maybe they're doing less damage than they did before, okay? And because they have less scope to be doing it in, and because things are sloshing around in the private market, okay?
So I'll just add a sort of a macro perspective here. The structural reforms that were put in place after the crisis were far from perfect. I think this is a feature of when you have to legislate and regulate in a crisis, right? That is the wrong time to be putting things in place. You're gonna miss things, you're gonna get things wrong. There's a moment of panic, there's a big sort of blame game going on. It is ideally the wrong time. And that's essentially what happened, right? In essence, DoddFrank came at a time when the crisis was, had happened. People weren't exactly sure what the causes were, and yet there was a real appetite that there needed to be changes. So it was far from perfect. That said, just to put a note of a little bit of optimism in the room, there were some things that I think were done well. And by the way, I'm completely with Steve on the limitation of 13.3, the lender of last resort authority. That could really come back to bite. That was, by the way, punishment to the Fed. Okay, that was 13.3 was considered Fed. You are a little bit, thinking you're, omnipotent here. Lender of last resort. We're going to pull this back a little bit so that you can't do what is called, you're going to have to do generalized lending in a crisis. You can't do specific, put out specific fires. So that's going to, mark my words, that's going to be an issue. But things that did work, and I talked about those 4 sort of structural features before, right? So let's talk about financial stability. Looking at financial stability, where does that sit? It doesn't sit in a single regulator. It sits within a body that is supposed to come together regularly to talk about developing systemic risk. It's another acronym, it's the FSOC, sorry about that, but it stands for the Financial Stability Oversight Council, where the heads of the regulatory agencies, the #1 people, come together in a room, in the cash room at Treasury, and sit down and talk about, are there risks developing in the seams within the pockets of our agencies? We are, the idea is like, we're smart people, we have data, what are we seeing that can actually start to identify early risks? That mechanism was put in place in Dodd-Frank. I would argue, okay, you might think, oh, why don't we have a single regulator in this country? I don't think that is the answer, but this is an attempt really to bring discussions together, to bring expertise together. So that is one piece. On the consumer side, there was the creation of the Consumer Protection Finance Bureau, right? The idea, and that was a whole title of Dodd-Frank, the idea was, wait a minute, consumer protection was getting a back seat by the federal regulators. Let's give it an agency where it is going to be its sole focus. So there was the creation of the CFPB. In terms of GSE reform, okay, can't really give good news there. We've got Fannie and Freddie in conservatorship, okay, and they have been in conservatorship now for 10 years. So that, I would argue, needs to be fixed. It has been attempted to be fixed. There have been, bipartisan legislation to try to fix it. Currently, the plan is to try to fix it without legislation. I say good luck on that, but that is a feature that really has not been addressed. And the 4th piece, wholesale funding, I think there's much greater transparency now in terms of what goes on in wholesale funding markets. That, I think, was one of the good stories of the financial crisis, is that there was a lot of learning done on how repos work, why they matter, what is securities lending, what do these transactions mean, why are they important, how do we start to get important signals from them. So, I would say that there's sort of a mixed story to be told on those, at least on those 4 pieces.
Great. Before I'm going to preview this for our panelists so they can be thinking about this, Steve, you're going to be caught on right away. I'd like to prompt the question of what do you think is the biggest threat that we have going forward for that. But if we can, I think something that is on at least had been on a number of people's minds was really about what happened with the individuals who were in the banks at the time, and what is the perspective? And certainly there was a lot of discussion shortly after in a lot of newspapers about why did there seem to be so little, if you will, sanctioning and punishment there. And I'm wondering if you could just speak to that for a bit.
Sure. I guess the classic way of putting it is, why didn't more bankers go to jail? And, there are a number of answers to this. I've done a study of it a few years ago. One impediment is the complexity of financial innovation joined with the decentralization of managerial responsibilities. Many of these complex instruments were put together at lower levels, not at the most senior levels of management. And prosecutors began to prosecute people at that level, and what they found was that juries would throw out the verdict because they felt that why should these low-level people be prosecuted when the more senior people sort of were not? So that was one of the problems. Another problem is that prosecutor offices sort of a lot of the resources post 9/11 have been devoted to terrorism and financial fraud. Almost all the financial fraud that's being prosecuted has to do with Ponzi schemes, and they really didn't have the expertise to try to dig into these individual cases. So what prosecutors started doing, instead of essentially promulgating personal liability, was to take the easier and less costly route of imposing firm-level liability, commencing lawsuits against the firms, which then would settle as a cost of doing business effectively, but it would create great headlines in the media, and everyone seemed to be happy. Another part of the answer, though, as to why more people weren't put into jail is that it's dubious that many of the managers of the banks and other systemically important firms actually broke the law. You see a lot of allegations that there was wrongdoing, but that's because human nature is to essentially attribute wrongdoing to things that go bad. And I would argue that there was, in fact, excessive risk-taking by the big banks. But why did that occur? I think there are at least two reasons besides wrongdoing that could explain it. One is that there are inherent conflicts of interest between the people who put these deals together and the more senior managers of these institutions. Now, DoddFrank and sort of principal agency theory looks at conflicts between a firm and its owners. Therefore, and sometimes they focus on the senior managers. But as transactions become more complex, it's the vice presidents, the senior analysts, who really understand these transactions. And they portray them to the senior managers using things like, value at risk, VAR, which is sort of hard to understand and get through. And I think we need to better essentially mitigate these intra-firm conflicts between the people who put these deals together and the senior managers and the owners on the other hand. Another reason I think there was excessive risk-taking, other than violating the law, is really the shareholder governance theory of management. Shareholder governance essentially looks to the value to the shareholders. And for most firms, historically, that was fine. It's always recognized that there were externalities to the public, but those are dealt with by specific laws that prohibit actions. They're dealt with by the tort system that internalizes costs. But where the harm is a systemically important firm basically failing, and externalizing risk that undermines the economy. Tort law does not begin to grapple with that, and specific laws really have not adequately grappled with that. And so we really need to think about whether there should be, for large banks and other systemically important firms, some sort of public governance duty, or at least responsibility, to take the public into account.
Thanks. Thank you very much, Steve. So primed here for biggest threat facing us, Jim.
Well, something will happen again. Hopefully it won't be as big as the financial crisis. I mean, that was a whopper, but we'll have problems. And so what keeps me awake at night, okay? And to be the idea that how our private markets have grown, and they're so big and they're so important and they're so highly leveraged. And the big universal solvent for me for so much of what was going on in the financial crisis of 2008, 2009 was the causes came out of the lack of transparency. I mean, I mentioned earlier the over-the-counter derivatives market, but also who was paying attention to the composition of these asset-backed securities and lots of other things that were going on. And you get into the private markets, and by definition, they're not very transparent, okay? And they have grown substantially since 2010. Now the major way of accumulating capital is not through any kind of registered offering. I'm not talking about just equities, I'm talking about bonds. It's in the private sector. And we know that a huge amount of the financing that of business enterprises have drifted in that direction. So we don't know much about that black box that's happening. What have we done to kind of address this problem? We've actually done a couple of things that are very subtle that made the private market even bigger. That is that we now, for example, private market's made up of individuals who are called accredited investors. And one way that individuals get into accredited investors is they have a net worth of $1 million, or they have taxable income as an individual of $200,000 and $300,000. Those are pretty low figures. Those are really very low figures when you think that those figures came into existence in 1983 and haven't been indexed, right? So whatever we were thinking about in 1983 when we created this concept, we've just halved it, okay? So it's a lot, that market's getting a lot bigger. You say, well, let's move out of that. Well, we had something called the Jobs Act in April of 2012 that came in, which was one of these bits of legislation that Congress did to go back and tell people we were doing a good job and never held any hearings, et cetera. One of the things they did is they raised the number of record holders you have to be a public company. So if you have an investment vehicle out there in the old days, and maybe if you went out and approached people and you got 501, you had to become a reporting company and stepped into the public domain. Now that number is 2,000, okay, quadrupled it like that. So that's one thing that makes that private market bigger. That's the point. And so what keeps me awake at night is not knowing what's happening out there and the degree of leverage that's going on. And we all know that related to this is this whole thing about leverage. We know that companies are leveraged up to the hilt. We also know that the 2017 legislation put a ceiling on the amount of leverage you have. It's stepping in this year, and then it's going to go with vengeance, okay, in about 3 more years. About how much interest how much of a tax shield you can have on your debt. And we also know that huge amounts of corporate lending is going from the private sector into these enterprises that are heavily leveraged. So if the economy slows down, or even if the economy doesn't slow down, you don't have so much of a tax shield like that, we're going to look at a problem. Okay? Now, I don't know how big that problem is going to be, but it's going to be a problem. So that's my concern. Okay.
Sarah, what keeps you up?
So I'm concerned about our resilience, okay? About our economy's resilience. What do I mean by that? I think that there's going to be some shock. Okay, you're always going to have some kind of exogenous shock. It can come from anything. My sort of pet theory at the moment is that we could have a shock coming from a cyber attack. that actually freezes liquidity because of a lack of an inability to be able to take sort of the attacked area offline and be able to continue to conduct business. But putting the sources aside of sort of what causes the shock, what I am concerned about is that there will be some shock, and that it will take us a long time to recover. So in other words, you hope for like a V shape, right? You've got your downturn and you bounce right back up. What I think about is what happens if it is not V, but it is L, right? You've got your downturn and then you are just stuck there. We cannot muster the wherewithal to actually bounce back. Why am I concerned about that? Because, first of all, when you have a long-term downturn, as we did in the financial crisis, expectations change, behaviors change. I mean, there's huge costs and damage done when you have long-term downturns. So we want any downturn, we have to be short-lived. How do we build resilience? In other words, that bounce back. How do we assure that it's going to be short? Well, I like what I was hearing actually in earlier panels about this idea that firms now are taking internal controls and risk management much more seriously, that they, in essence, are taking on board what is required themselves to actually be able to do what is necessary to bounce back, to have the safeguards in place that make any downturn short-lived. That's a good development. It's especially a good development in light of the fact that we are taking off a lot of the guardrails from a financial regulatory perspective, okay? To Steve's point, the 13.3 lender of last resort weakened. Enforcement, much lower now than in the last several years. Big deregulatory efforts, a lot of rules that were put in place coming off. There was a rule in DoddFrank regarding executive compensation, figuring out ways in which you sort of benchmark that to risk-taking off the table. So there is a highly deregulatory environment right now, coupled with all of the things you've heard here regarding what has not been addressed, lower transparency, problems with rating agencies, incomplete fixes in securitization. You couple that all together, and the question for me is that going to hinder firms' ability to bounce back?
Thanks. And Steve, before, I want you to answer this question as well, but one thing that I've heard now come up in a lot of the comments from both the prior panel and this one is really around human behavior and the notions of confidence, fear, changing expectations, all of these different ones. And I'm wondering if you can address some of that too in your response here.
Sure, and actually I've written a paper on that recently. I think that essentially regulation is intended to address market failures, and human behavioral limitations create at least two market failures that essentially underlie financial regulation. One is that parties have full information, and the other is that they'll act in their rational self-interest. And I'm not sure that regulation can always correct these failures, one, because things have gotten so complex, and the other is because there are all these problems we have as humans. So if I categorize the limitations, and there are no clear categories, we certainly have herd behavior, the idea that you sort of follow other firms, and this certainly in part may have explained this feeding frenzy for mortgage-backed securities that was evident in 2005 and 2006 and the beginning of 2007. You have various cognitive biases to try to simplify reality, such as availability bias and optimism bias. Availability bias would be that what you saw recently, you believe. Housing prices are increasing, they will continue to increase. Optimism bias, this is one of the oldest biases. You have the oracle at Delphi where the king goes and says, what happens if I invade? And the oracle says, you'll destroy a mighty kingdom. And the king goes forward and invades, not realizing it's his own kingdom. So you have that. You have over-reliance on heuristic simplifications. Credit ratings exemplify that. And I think many investors looked at the credit ratings and decided to go with that itself and not make their own investigation. And then you have the whole issue of panic. You're talking about sort of toxic assets. If there hadn't been a panic in the mortgage-backed securities markets, I don't think these assets would have been regarded as toxic. And in fact, many of the mortgage-backed securities ultimately paid. The problem was the market value. So an example, in 2008, I was an expert witness for the High Court of Justice in London on the bankruptcy of the largest structured investment vehicle, Orion Funding. And the market value of its assets, mortgage-backed securities, was approximately 21 cents on the dollar. But if you look to the intrinsic value, most of the mortgagors were prime obligors on these mortgages. They had jobs, you had good collateral value, and if you look to the, what would be expected to be paid, it would be over 80% on a present value basis. So why was the market value 21 cents? And the answer was truly a panic. And what does that teach us? That, ultimately, notwithstanding our best efforts, we're never going to have perfect financial regulation. And so there inevitably will be failures. How do we deal with that? Maybe one way is to take inspiration from complex engineering systems where there are going to inevitably be failures, so-called chaos theory, and design regulation not only to try to prevent the failures, but also to try to essentially mitigate its harmful consequences when it occurs, and to sort of compartmentalize the areas that it can impact.
Thanks. Thank you all. And we have some time. I'd love to open this up for questions from our audience. We have some microphones over here. If you just give an indication, we'll try to get that to you. There's one up there. And
hi. So do you think there might be a bit of a failure of independence if we think the Fed is the lender of last resort, but it seems like they are also interested in, if they really think bailouts are the route to go, Tim Geithner came out and said, or Ben Bernanke came out and said, but they still seem interested in getting political cover for the administration. So how do you sort of maintain that independence where if they really think the bailout is the right option, then they shouldn't have to worry about the political implications per se?
So it's a great question. So, the independence of the central bank, I think, is of critical importance. It is the one, well, I shouldn't say the only, but it is one of the few agencies in the economic policy making realm that has been designed and has, with good reason, to be independent of political pressure, independent of sort of presidential interference. It is meant to be that way because one of the important mandates of the Fed and the central bank is price stability and maximum employment. And those, in order to get those right, you really have to think long term, and you must have a long-term perspective, and you don't want political headwinds to interfere. So when you have central banks, and when you evaluate central banks, you want to see that they have the right degree of independence and that they, in fact, operate with that with that independence. So to your question on 13.3, you know, query as to whether you know, Congress sort of limiting the use of that tool is an incursion into that independence. Congress still, you know, first of all, the Fed is not allowed to like, you know, operate without any rules at all. Congress sets the rules. So it was Congress's determination for, you know, for whatever reason, you know, we can agree or disagree that authority needed to be limited. I think that was unfortunate, but I don't think that it was the fact of Congress actually setting a parameter was the wrong thing. I don't view that as problematic from an independence perspective. I view it as problematic from a result perspective. But in terms of Congress, I mean, the Fed has to be accountable too, and it is accountable to its creator, and that was the Congress.
Jim.
So despite everything else I've said this morning, I actually am an optimist about so many things. So if you're in your deathbed, I'm the guy you want to talk to, okay? And let me tell you why I'm very optimistic about this, okay? And it's on two different fronts. History, okay? We had absolute authority to save Lehman Brothers, and we didn't. And 2 days later, we had absolutely no authority, legal authority to save AIG, and we did, okay? So we'll go right through that red light, okay? Recent history. That was 10 years ago history, right? Recent history. You know, if it gets bad enough and the political chips are there, and depending on who's in office and worried about that, we're going to build that wall, right? We're going to go right through, declare a national emergency, and we're going to save whatever that institution is. So that's the cause of my like that. So we're either going to go through the red light, or we're going to change the table, games on the table, and we're going to go ahead and save them. That's what's going to happen.
I think there was a question up here.
So this question is for whoever it might be most appropriate to, but we've talked a lot about the US regulatory system, but in the medium term, do you think that it's possible a major global financial crisis could emanate from a country like China or Japan and Germany? And if so, are those regulatory systems there robust enough to respond? And you know, how have they adapted to the most recent recession? And is there any kind of international coordination between regulatory bodies? Or do they all operate in like silos?
That's a terrific question. Yeah. Do you want to do it?
Yeah, sure. I mean, you have the Financial Stability Board, the FSB, not to be confused with the KGB successor. And you know, essentially, you know, it's a G20. They coordinate and they try to make rules that are proposed for countries. The EU has done a great deal to try to mitigate the impact of the financial crisis. And they look to what the US does, and the US looks to what the EU does. In the EU, for example, I think some of their regulatory efforts have actually are better than ours here in the States. Take securitization, for example. They've gone beyond what the US does, and they've created incentives for what they call STS, or simple, transparent, and standardized securitization deals that model the deals on what makes a lot of sense. Securitization can be very economically efficient in terms of allocating risk to the investors that want to take the risk, and also in terms of multiplying funding for bank lending, as an example. And the EU recognizes that, and they say if you have a sort of traditional type of securitization, investors can invest in the securities in those deals with very minimal capital requirements compared to more complex securitizations. And so the EU is doing a lot. China is trying to do a lot, been working with government officials to some extent. The problem is that they do have a very bifurcated regulatory sort of establishment, and they're sort of flowing around. And they also have a very diffuse shadow banking system. So, you know, we'll see. I mean, Japan is pretty good, but most of the major countries are following the FSB's recommendations.
It's really, you know, you've got to remember, our financial institutions don't operate within our borders. They are international, global institutions. So your point is really well taken, because you can have a shock coming from any part of the world, and you can have the contagion also be such that it spills over borders. So, you know, to Steve's point, there is good work being done. You have to do exercises. This is one of the things that we tried to simulate in the last Treasury Department, which is let's simulate a cross-border failure. You know, name a hypothetical financial institution that has a shock that affects its UK, operations. What happens? And we did real exercises where you actually brought the heads of, the FSB and the central and the ECB, and put everybody in a room and said, okay, let's do this exercise. How do we talk to each other? What are our first steps? How do we keep our own countries from ring fencing assets instead of supporting subsidiaries in other countries? How are we going to react? Those exercises, and they take the form of what was called orderly liquidation authority often, but how will regulators really react in exactly the situation that you're imagining? I think that has to be practiced. I don't think you can just imagine it will happen smoothly without some pre-think.
Yeah, I would add, before I became a full-time academic, I was a partner at a major Wall Street law firm and an adjunct professor. And one of my main areas was insolvency and bankruptcy law. And what we found is anytime a company went into bankruptcy, it went into bankruptcy for reasons that no one would have predicted when it was doing well. And everything was completely different than we possibly could have predicted. So I do have questions about the orderly liquidation authority, so-called living wills, the idea that you plan for your demise with minimal systemic impact. I think Sarah's absolutely right. We need to practice it as much as we can, but we're never going to get it perfect.
So I think the biggest surprise in the early weeks of the financial crisis, that was in late September and early October of 2008, for me anyway, was the following. And that is the tremendous role that was being played by what I would call non-political enterprises like the Fed, and the ECB, and what have you like that, that within a very short period of time, harmonious reaction of flushing in billions and billions of dollars into the system, okay? There's a credit crunch, and so trying to get money out there and expand the money supply was a good idea. And just seeing that happen. And so it's a testament to the fact that not all organizations that have and touch people's lives and on which countries depend have to be elected bodies, okay?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I think we have a question here. Is that right? And I think this will probably be our last question, because we're here between you and lunch, and I don't like that position.
So I was thinking about what you were saying, Jim, regarding sort of the lack of standardization, right, of credit ratings and making the comparison with accounting. And that got me thinking about the insurance industry and sort of, the impact that they played during the crisis, not only with monolines, but AIG, but even now as significant holders of fixed income. And I'm curious to hear your thoughts on sort of, I guess, the lack of standardization, insurance mainly being still regulated at the state level and not having sort of a more federal mandate on that, and sort of maybe potential inconsistencies with respect to insurance regulation as sort of being another player going forward.
Oops.
That was a literal mic drop right there. So.
Yeah, that's right. Actually, my son and I have written, my son is a law professor at Minnesota, and his field is insurance. And a couple of years ago, we wrote an article, and you can find it in the University of Chicago Law Review, and it has a title like, "Is Insurance Systemically Risky?" And we looked through that, and we conclude that, in fact, it can be systemically risky for any number of reasons. Of course, one thing it gets to be fairly complex, but we laid out a number of arguments, including the one thing that's very concerned is the reinsurance market that is completely opaque and huge. The Fed asked us to testify, so we did, and they're concerned, and FSOC is concerned about this. But the insurance industry is very powerful, and they put out position papers saying that insurance is not systemically risky. And of course, the designation by FSOC of firms like, MetLife as systemically important has been challenged in court, and it's been dropped. And one might question the merits of why it was dropped. It turns on whether the FSOC did a cost-benefit analysis of whether to designate MetLife as systemically important. They didn't, but DoddFrank specifically says you don't need to do that. But the courts essentially said you should do that. But the bottom line is I fear that insurers are systemically risky. They can be. I don't think we adequately address it. Dodd-Frank has some very minimal sort of federal regulation, but essentially insurance in the US is still regulated on a state-by-state basis. State insurance funds are actually not pre-funded. Most of them are put together on an ex-post basis. There are a lot of concerns.
On that note, hugely optimistic note, if I could do two things, help thank our panelists and hear from Lee.
Thank you, everyone. So we're now going to take a 30-minute lunch break. Lunch is available right next door in Kirby Reading Room. There'll be people outside pointing you in the right direction. We'll start up here at 12:45 with a talk on behavioral decision making. You are allowed to bring your lunch in here and eat it if you want to do so. Thank you.